Hi, welcome back. In the last video, we saw how we could create different sorts of routing, some of them more complex routings. In this video, we are going to start doing some more interesting things, and we are going to see how we can start creating our database models and then interacting and interfacing with them with some controllers that we're going to create together. I am on the regular GitHub page. If you go further down into the documentation, the sections that we're going to be looking at today are mainly going to revolve around the model section and the controller section. Okay, so let's dig into the code to see how we could start creating our models and creating our databases. So I will open brackets to the same place where we were last time. I always like to go back to the default folder structure and folder content of Caligraphy, just to get us into the habit of doing that more often. So in the web.php, the last time we looked at different ways of doing the routes, so I completely got rid of all of this and came back to the default web.php file. And no worry there, because anyway, anything that we're going to be doing today is going to be entirely new and entirely dedicated to this section. So the first thing whenever we're creating a model is to make sure that we have a database, okay? Now this framework does not provide any particular features to interface with the database or to do some SQL language. The creation part of the database, as well as the creation of the tables and all of that sort, needs to be done through MySQL, whichever way you would like. It needs to be an SQL language. In this particular case, we are going to be using MySQL, given that it's open source and given that it's quite well integrated with PHP in the general sense. But this can be done in any SQL language that you prefer. So how do we do that? I do have an SQL file that's already there for us to create a very simple database using MySQL. I will not go through the details of the syntax of MySQL. If you want to know more about this, I would encourage you to look at the documentation. But usually you should not be scared about writing in MySQL, okay? Especially when it's just about creating tables, dropping tables, adding attributes, and things of that nature. This can be done very quickly, and it can be done once, and from the moment you do it once, it could apply to the different tables that you're creating. What matters most in databases is to make sure that you get a right model. Okay, why? Because you don't want to change that often. So from the beginning, you gotta spend some time into figuring out what the database needs for your application is. Now, provided you have done all this, I do have a simple MySQL script in here, and that MySQL script only has one table in it, and that table is really, we're calling it posters, and it has a set of attributes that are particular to that table. Okay, so today we are only going to deal with one table, and we're going to see how we can interface with that table by doing some simple CRUD operations. What do we mean by CRUD operations? It means creating, it means removing, it means updating, and it means deleting and reading. Okay, so C, create, R is for read, U is for update, and D is for delete, which gives us the CRUD the CRUD operations that we usually talk about on the web in general. So this is the script that we're going to be applying. Now, before getting into all this, we need a way to interface with MySQL. It could very much be done through the terminal. So if you have done this before, I would encourage you to keep doing the same thing, to create a database and then to create a table in there that mimics a little bit the table that you find in here. If not, and if you have PHP MyAdmin, this is a fantastic application that is open source. You can download it, and it would help you do all these mechanical things with the databases in an interface fashion, using a UI instead of doing it using code. Okay, so I happen to have PHP MyAdmin installed in my local environment, and we are going to be using this throughout this video, at least to create the database and then to execute this SQL code that we just saw together. Now, just a simple note, depending on where you want to, what server you're using or what host you're using to put your application in production, some hosts may allow you to have something like PHP MyAdmin installed on that side. But if not, I mean, there are always easy ways to use, the terminal and to interface with MySQL through the terminal. Remember, all that you need to do is to actually create a database and then run a script. And if you have that script somewhere in a file, it's very easy to run it, even if you're doing it through the terminal. So the first step is really to have a database created. And in order to do this, we're going to use PHP MyAdmin in my particular case. So I'm going to log in because there's always somehow credentials to access your database engine. Um, and in here, we are going to create together a new database. How do we do this in PHP MyAdmin? If you look at the left-hand side, there's this new link. You click on it, and it tells you, do you want to create a database? Yes, we do. We're going to call our database, we're going to call it posters. And now there's always a need to specify what engine or what collation we want to use. And this is mainly for language reasons. It's an encoding of some sort, and I strongly encourage you to always use UTF-8. I personally use UTF-8 in the general CI, so you could use that. The UTF-8 engine is very diverse, and it could allow for different languages and things like that, which can be helpful if your application is supporting several languages. So let's go ahead and do that, and then we're going to create the database, and voila, the database is created. You can see it. It got listed on the left hand side in here, but notice that the database has no tables at this stage of the game. So how are we going to do this in order to get the tables? So you've seen the script that I have, and ideally you would have something similar to this. It could be for one table or for multiple tables. This doesn't matter. For the sake of this video, we are going to go very simple, and we're only going to have one table. We are going to look further into how to create relations among tables in an SQL environment. We are going to do this when we get to the dedicated section that talks about relationships, which is going to come next when we start doing more complex stuff in the videos. For the time being, we are only doing one table, maybe two, but for as long as there are no relationships among the tables, this is exactly what this video is going to be about. Okay, so now we need to import that code in order to execute it directly in PHP MyAdmin. So in order to do that, we hit on import. We say choose file, and this is going to redirect me to my desktop file structure, and I am going to choose the SQL script that is locally on my machine. And I hit the go button, and when I do that, ideally it executes, and if everything is okay, you would see it a success message in here. Now let's go and validate if this got created correctly. And in fact, now this is my posters database, and inside my posters database, excuse the redundancy, but we do have a table called posters. So this is the table, and if we go and take a look at the structure of that table, so if I hit structure in here, we can see it has an ID, it has a title, it has a category, content, short description, URL, image URL, created at, and modified at, which if we compare it to the code, this is exactly what these statements were trying to achieve. So far, we have a database and we have a table in our database. So we are ready. Now we can jump ahead and go back to our calligraphy environment in brackets. And the first thing that we need to do before starting anything is to make sure that in our .env we are activating the MySQL PDO or the MySQL engine, and that we're providing the credentials of our of our database connection. So how do we do this? If you noticed in the .m, there is a DB section in here, a big one. So we're gonna go through each and every one of those, and I'll tell you which ones would be interesting to change. So one thing for sure is we definitely need to activate. So that flag over here needs to be changed to true, because from this point on, we are going to use a database, so we're gonna activate it. Now, for this to work properly, the credentials need to be right. Otherwise, it's gonna generate some errors. So what are the credentials, or the main credentials that we need to look at? We need to look at the database. So that would be the name of the database, not the table. Okay, so it happens that our database is called posters, so we replace this with poster. And then our username, in my particular case, the username is root, so I left it as is. And just for the sake of this video, the password is really 1234. So those are the three elements that are primary to define a connection and to connect an interface with the database. You need a database name, you need the username, and you need the password. All the other stuff can be used exactly as is, and those are the default values for any sort of connection with the database. The first one over here is called DB connection. If it happens to be a MySQL adapter that you're using, then it needs to be MySQL. If you're using something else, such as Oracle or any other provider, then in that case you would enter the name of the adapter that you need to use to interface with these databases. The DB host in this particular case, or even when you're on a production server, is always the local host, which is 127.0.0.1. This is home, really. So usually it's always like this, unless it's specified differently, or unless you are using a separate route for your MySQL. In that case, this is where you would change the host. The port is always by default 3306 for interfacing with the adapters, with databases. This is what comes out of the box. But then if for whatever reason that port is changed, then you could change it in here as well. So once we have this, now my .env is ready, and Calligraphy is really ready to make connections with the database. Okay, now the immediate next thing that we need to do is now start thinking about our models. Okay, so what is a model? If we have a table, then why do we need a model? The model is really a replica of what's happening in the database tables. Okay, it is an object that is contained within Calligraphy. Okay, and there is mirroring what is happening in the tables behind the scenes. And why is this important? Because having an object representation will help you, instead of directly interfacing with the database and making requests constantly to the database, you could make this kind of interfacing with the object, and only when you're ready to commit back to the database and to either update or do a certain query on the database, only then you'll be able to do it. So for many reasons, it could help with performance for sure, but it could also help in writing a neat code and a well structured code. So how do we create a model in Calligraphy? Remember, everything that we're going to be doing is on the client side, so we are always going to be in the application structure. Okay, now in this particular case, we are going to create a model, so we're going to go in there and let's take a look. There's an authentication out of the box that comes pre-packaged with Calligraphy, which we will talk about down the road. I don't want you to worry about it right now, but inside this models folder, you can create as many subfolders as you want, and I strongly encourage you to do this every time you wanna create an application, is to have different folders, and each folder is about to cover either a certain group of tables within your database, or it could be just simply one. It makes the structure cleaner, and at the same time it helps with the maintenance significantly. If for whatever reason you want to delete an entire group of things, then you could immediately delete the folder without having to deal with separate files. So in order to do that, you just need to create a folder in here, and let's in our case call it posters, okay? Pretending we're going to pretend that the name of our application is posters. So we'll create a posters folder under the model structure, and in there we are going to create our first model. Our first model is going to be poster.php. Okay. Now, calligraphy is not extremely strict on the naming convention, but there is a standard in the industry to make sure that at least your classes are always singular and they start with a capital letter. Okay, it would be good to follow that standard, just so that you know of its existence as well. So let's go ahead. It is a PHP file, and now it is a class, and it's called poster in our case. And all the models in calligraphy, they extend a core, one of the core classes that is called model. Okay, why do we have this principle? We've also seen this in the controllers in the previous video. Why? Because it gives us a set of methods out of the box that are ready to be used and that make your programming nightmare a lot easier. Okay, so it has some prefabricated functions and methods and properties that can help accelerate your work significantly, and we're going to see a lot of these today. So let's go ahead and do that. So remember, always make sure to extend model. Great. Now, what does this model contain? For the time being, since we're only dealing with a simple table, okay, and we have no relationships yet, the only thing that these models contain is the exact structure that is in here, okay? So all you need to do is to make sure that you have properties that mimic variables coming exactly from with the same name as the structure that you have in your MySQL. So we have title, then we have public category. Oh, I'm gonna probably make a lot of mistakes in here. Then we have content, then we have public short description, then we have public URL, then we have public image URL, public created at, and the last one, public modified at. One thing that I would like to tell you is we really take a look at the structure, and in our particular case, not all of these attributes are required. Okay, so how do we know whether an attribute is required or null? We need to look at the null value and whether or not it has a default value by default. So for example, ID is never null, okay, and in this particular case it is auto increment, so it is automatically created for you every time a record is added to the database. So we do not necessarily need to have an ID in our model. It is just a standard to have the entire list of attributes in here, whether they are required or not required, whether they are defaulted or not defaulted. Why? Because it's always a great reference to go back to the file and make sure that you have a right schema. A right schema that is represented in your model and that mirrors the structure in your database. When you start omitting certain attributes and properties here and there, you might reach some discrepancies, which could down the road lead to some confusion in the code. The best practice is to always make sure that you are completely mirroring whatever the structure of your database table into the model. And this is it. This is really actually everything that the model contains. Okay. Now we created the model. Great, but how do we interface with it? And this is the beauty now of the controller. The controller is in an MVC structure, so we just covered the model piece of MVC. And the C of it is the controller. The controller is playing that interface between the model and the code, okay? And it's going to do any logic that is needed for you to do or that your application needs to do on whatever comes from the database, meaning whatever comes from the model. And then at some point when we start looking at the views, we're going to see how it is also the controller that is going to return all that information to be rendered in the view. So the controller is really the central piece in an MVC structure, and the more you have a good handle of what a controller does, what properties a controller has, and what methods a controller has within a framework, then you probably covered 70% of what a framework is. Okay? So for that to happen, then we need to create controllers, and we're going to do exactly the same thing here. Remember, it's a good practice to try and categorize them all under one folder. We're going to call it posters, just to do the liaison between the two. But this is more of a semantic structure. There's nothing in the back end, that link them at all. So I don't want you to think that they need to be called the same way. No, they do not. Okay, it could be called banana, and things will work just perfectly fine. Now within this posters, we're going to create a new file, and this file is going to be called postercontroller.php. Again, the naming convention is very it's a standard in the industry. It's always good to have the name of the object or the model that you're treating, and then append the word controller to it. That would facilitate the code. It would help other programmers who are reading your code to understand it, to understand your structure better. Okay, now just like we created controllers in the previous videos, we're going to do exactly the same thing in here. So it's a poster controller class, and remember, it extends controller. And if you remember well from the last time, there is a bunch of functions in here, because all the logic, like we mentioned previously, need to be contained within a function. And there is this out-of-the-box function called index, which we will see once we create our routes, why it's helpful again. But if you remember well, we are going to create this out-of-the-box function. And what we want to do initially, before doing anything, let's just say something about what needs to be done in the controllers, no matter which method you have, and how do we link the controller now to the model. If you are familiar with other frameworks such as either Laravel or Symfony, okay? In Laravel in particular, they have an implied connection. Just by simply following a naming convention, they could link the controller to the appropriate model, okay? Calligraphy in that sense is more flexible. Calligraphy allows you, no matter how you call the controller, okay, to always have an explicit way of linking it to the model, okay? And it doesn't have to be, each controller needs to be linked to one and only one model. And we're going to see this at some point in the future. You can associate a model to a different, associate a controller to different models, and they don't necessarily have to be linked to the same table in the database, which is a great flexibility that Calligraphy has. So how do we do this? I will just simply go to the documentation in here, and I am going to take you to the controller section and to the controller methods, because there are a bunch of methods out of the box that could be applied to the controller that helps you do this kind of things. And one of these methods that is allowing the association between a controller and a database and its equivalent table is called the associate method. Okay, so by calling the associate method, you are associating to the controller the model name along with the name of the table in the database. Okay, so how do we apply this? Going back to the code, all you need to do, you're going to say this, okay, referring to the controller itself, and you're going to say that this one is associated with my poster model in string format, and it's going to be associated to the table called posters in my database. Okay, and that will do it. Sorry, my quotes were all over the place. And here we go. And now we created an association between the poster controller and the poster. And we can do all sorts of functionalities and apply them to this model. And what do I mean by this? Is like all of these functionalities are now ready for you to use, and there is a handful of them that are extremely useful to do things like reading entries from the database, or saving entries, or deleting entries, or searching entries, and things like that. So basically, all the CRUD operations are given to you out of the box to be used. And this is exactly what we are going to do together today. We are going to explore all these functionalities, the CRUD operations mainly, that are provided to us out of the box in the controller. So let's go ahead and start. For the index, what we are going to do, we are going to read all the entries of the posters table. So how do we do this? It's as simple as saying this all. Okay, this all will return all the entries that are in the database. Now, in order for us to see them, since we don't have views yet, the best way is to really dump this functionality. And by doing dump, it's just going to echo everything on the screen for us. Great. So now I have a controller that has an index that returns all the entries in my database, ideally. But we still need to make sure that we have the right route to it. So we're gonna go back here, and we're gonna make sure to change all this again. And for our root, we are going to call our poster controller. And we're not going to target any function because it's the index and it's implied, so we don't have to add any action in here. So now what this is going to tell me is go when every time I type localhost / posters in my particular case, under the root, it's going to redirect to the poster controller, which ideally the poster controller is going to dump all the entries that are in my posters table. So let's see if that works. Let's go to our browser. We're going to do localhost / posters, and now, it's empty. And yes, indeed, it is empty, right? We haven't added anything to the database yet. If we go to browse, it doesn't have anything in it. So let's stay on this page for now, and then we'll refresh it as soon as we create some more functionalities to see how that database is changing based on the code that we're typing. So now let's go back. Now let's create a function where at least we can add entries to this database. Okay, so we're going to say public function, and let's call it add. Great. Now, in order for us to add, we always, again, need to associate. Don't forget that. So we're going to associate poster to posters. Always start with this in each and every function. Now, there are ways, if you want, to create a separate function that does the association for you, and then you always point to it. Okay, so there are ways to avoid having you to type this all over again every time. But for the purpose of this exercise, let's do it like this. It gets us into the habit of understanding the structure of the controller. It always starts with the association and with the context of it, and the context of it is the model poster and the table posters. Great. Now, in order for us to add a record to our poster table, what we really need to do is create a poster that is of type poster the model. So I'm going to do a new poster like that. And for that poster, we need now to fill it with the information that we wanna pass on to the database and in order to create the record. Now notice at this stage we don't have any UI, so we're not posting any information. We're just trying to interface with the database. Further down, when we get to the section when we start talking about views, we're going to see how we could link that information to a form where the user can type in some information that we fetch from this function and then pass on to the database. But for the time being, we're going to create a variable directly in the function that is called poster of type poster, and then we're going to give it the required information that are needed to create a record. What are the required information? If we go back to the structure of this, it's really the title and the category. The ID is automatically generated for us. Okay, title and category, they are both they both cannot be null and they don't have any default, so those are the two required one that that need to be passed on. Otherwise, the record cannot be created. This is exactly what this is telling us. Okay, whether it's the content, short description, URL, and all the others, if you look at those, they are yeah, they can be null. Okay, so they don't need any default, and they would remain null for as long as they have no information in them, and they will not stop the database from creating a record. So let's go back to the code, and so what we the two attributes that we need to create are title, and just for the purpose of this exercise, and we can say hello world, okay? And then the content, oh sorry, the category is going to be test. Great. So now we created our object, but our object is contained within Caligraphy. Now we need a way to say, okay, now send this to the database. So how do we do this? It's as easy as saying .this save, and what are we saving? We're saving poster. Okay, this is exactly it, and that's all you need to do. Now let's dump to see if it worked. And we need to create a web route to the add function. Let's go there, create a new route here. We're going to say /add. We're going to take it to poster controller at add. Now let's see what this one gives us. We'll go back to the code, /posters, and now we're going to do /add. Ooh, it returned something to us. Ideally, it returned this object, which we believe means that a record was created. So let's go to the database and check that. And here we go. Hello world, test. And since those are the two attributes that we specified, all the rest is set to null. If you notice, created at and modify that are also automatically created for you. And here we go. We created our first record in our database in just a couple of lines of code. How magical is that? Okay. Now let's go back to the controller. We can do even better. Let's go and try and edit this. Okay. Remember, we're going to go through all the CRUD functionality. So far we've done a read all. We've done an add. Now we're going to do an update. Okay. An update, let's call it an edit. It's an edit functionality. Now, we're gonna get a little, more sophisticated with that. We definitely first need to associate. Okay, and then posters. Nope, no S, and then posters. How are we gonna be sophisticated? This time we are gonna take the ID of the poster that we are going to update. We are gonna take it from our URI. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to actually not really, we're going to do something different than what we did in the previous video. So assuming that the ID is going to come through the URI. So what we need to do is we need to see, and the Caligraphy needs to check whether this ID exists in the database for us to change it. So what it's going to do, we're going to call a function called find. And just simply from saying .this find, okay, provided that our route already contains the ID in its definition, then it's really going to look for this. And let's do this, okay, just for the sake of it. And it's going to check whether or not this ID exists. And if it exists, it's going to return the object. So, well, actually, then in that case, let's do $poster is equal find $this find. So it's going to go and find it, and if it finds it, it's going to return the poster, so the entire poster that is associated, and that is the entire record and every value in it. Great. So now we need to check if .poster, which means if it found a poster, then what do we want to do? We want to edit it, right? So how do we do this? We need to first identify what values we want to change. So in order to change the values, we just need to say, I want to change the title to it worked, for example. Let's not change the category for now, but you could if you want to. But let's not change it. And now what else do we need to do? Now we need to save it. So what we're going to do, we're going to do this and save. .poster. And done. Ideally, this should work. Now we need to dump this value to see it. So we're going to do a dump. And then of course, if it doesn't exist, you can say echo it does not exist. Okay, let's test both. Now we need the route for this, and our route is what where the magic is going to happen. So what we're going to say is get, but this time, now of course we're using get throughout all of these because it's easy to test it out, but at some point the better way of doing addition and updates is to use post methods or put HTTP methods, which we will learn down the road. But for the time being, we're doing everything through a get, but the process is exactly the same when we do other sorts of HTTP methods. So in this case, we are going to edit, but what are we going to edit? We're going to edit a particular ID or a particular poster. And now we're going to send it to poster controller at edit. Let's see what this gives us. So now if I do /local /1/edit, because by the way, my ID is 1, okay? So ideally it exists. Let's see what that, oop, something happened. Ideally, the model did change the title. Now let's see if in the database it changed. So let's look in here. Saying hello world. If I refresh, now it's saying it worked. We just succeeded in editing in a couple of lines of code without doing almost any sort of thinking. If you think about it, it's just about applying the methods, and the more you get a handle of how to use the controller and how to use the methods and properties of the controller, this can become very very quick for you. Great. Now let's try a case where it doesn't exist. It does not exist. I just put ID2, but ID2 doesn't exist, so our function works, and it works beautifully. Okay. Now let's continue and go to the next function, and let's call it remove. Okay. What is remove going to do? It's going to completely get rid of the record. Same thing. We're going to associate. Okay. Now, since we are removing a particular ID as well, we still need to find it, because if it doesn't find it, then there's nothing to be removed. So we're going to do $poster exactly like we did before. And now how do we delete? It's as easy as saying this delete. Notice we don't even need to specify the ID because it's gonna find it automatically for us from the object. Let's go back to the documentation. Let's go to the delete function. Notice that it takes an ID equal to null, so it's going to delete a specific entry, and when ID is not provided, it is fetched from the requested URI. If it's fetched from the requested URI, then I don't even need to do this, okay? If I don't want to. You only need to do this if you want to check whether or not you know, the ID exists, and that's probably the only reason why you would want to do it. We'll try it in a while without this to see how it works, but otherwise it could be done in both ways. So let's do echo it does not exist. Now we need the route for it. Do you notice the pattern? You always create your controller, then you create the route to it. So now we do this ID. Again, we said, yeah, we could do delete if you want, or remove, it doesn't matter. Now poster controller at remove. That was the name of our function. So now if I go in here and I do to delete, ideally it should say it does not exist. It does not exist. Great. Now let's do one delete. And notice it's going to go away now. Oop, ideally, oh, I forgot to dump, so we don't know what's happening. But let's go to the database and refresh. And it's no longer there. Okay? So this is the beauty of a framework. It does most of the difficult things for you so that you focus on what matters the most in your application, as opposed to interfacing with the database and the logic. Now if you take a look at all this, we just created a complete CRUD operation in barely a dozen of lines. Okay, and we're doing some checking as well in here. We could even do it in quicker than that. Now let me go back a little bit to what I was saying in here. Over here, maybe we don't need to do any of this. Maybe all we need to do is dump $this delete. Okay. And if I do that, ideally it's going to go and try and find the ID. If it doesn't find the ID, then most likely it's going to return either an error or a false statement. So let's see what it does. Now in my case, I no longer have one anymore. So if I do this, you see it returns empty, which means it didn't do anything because it didn't find the element. What matters here is that it doesn't cause an exception that could lead to your application failing. Okay, and the way the delete works is it tries to find it. If it doesn't find it, then it will not do anything. Great. So let me now try and add another one. So let's do another add just for the sake of it over here. So let's do an add. Now we added another one. Notice that the ID is 2. Let's add a third one. Notice ID is 3. Of course, all the records now are the same. So we have a 2 and a 3. That's the 2, that's the 3. Now let's do an edit on number 2. Ideally, number 2 needs to have it worked when I refresh the page. So 2 has it worked. Now let's delete 3. Okay, we're going to 2 and then delete. And 2 is gone. Fantastic. So this is exactly what we wanted to show you today. What we learned is we learned how, one, to create a database, not necessarily from a syntactic point of view. We will leave it up to you to do that. But once your MySQL tables or your SQL database and tables are created, we learned how to link them and how to activate them from the framework. We learned how to create a model that is associated with one of these tables in the database, and then we looked at how a controller can help us interface with that model in very efficient ways. Okay, we hope you enjoyed this video. We will do more of this, and we are going to start to see even more interesting interactions in the upcoming videos. Probably in the immediate next one, we are going to look at authentication and how we could have a username and a password checked for a particular application, and how we could use the authentication to either allow or restrict access to certain ones of these methods within the controller. This is probably what we're going to do next in the upcoming videos. With that, we thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed this session.